On the morning of August 12, 1843, the silence of Willowbrook Plantation in South Carolina's Low Country was shattered by a woman's scream. What Catherine Hargrove witnessed in her husband's private quarters that morning would trigger a scandal so devastating that for 60 years, newspapers refused to print the details. Within 3 days, in Beaufort's town square, over 300 citizens gathered to witness a punishment so brutal that the memory would be carried by witnesses to their graves. All documents were sealed by the county until 1923. And when historians finally opened them, they discovered the truth was far darker than any rumor. This was not just about betrayal. It was about the complete destruction of a man's soul, orchestrated by the one person who knew exactly how to weaponize an entire community's rage. Before we continue with the story of Willowbrook Plantation and the scandal that destroyed the Hargrove family, I need you to do something. If this story is already giving you chills, subscribe right now. We uncover the darkest true stories from America's past, the ones deliberately hidden from history. Tell me in the comments what state you are listening from. Are you close to where this nightmare unfolded? Hit subscribe because what comes next is much worse. Now, let me take you back to 1843, to a world where reputation meant everything and to lose it was to lose your very existence. Beaufort, South Carolina in the early 1840s was a place built on contradictions. From ancient oaks, Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds, beautiful and suffocating. The air carried the scent of salt marsh and magnolia blossoms, a sweetness that could not mask the underlying decay. This was where fortunes rose from fields worked by enslaved hands, where white-columned mansions competed for the most impressive display of wealth and power. The highest tier of this society was occupied by the Hargrove family. Edmund Hargrove, 35 years old in 1843, had inherited Willowbrook Plantation from his father 7 years earlier. It was 3,000 acres of prime land, featuring a Greek Revival mansion completed in 1838. There were crystal chandeliers from France, heart pine floors so perfectly joined the seams were invisible. Edmund was exactly what a South Carolina gentleman should be. Tall, dark-haired, his shoulders broad from years of riding. He dressed impeccably, spoke with the measured cadence of old money, served on the town council, and held a position as church deacon. He was known as a fair master, which in that time meant he did not whip his slaves as often as his neighbors. But a secret that would destroy everything was held by Edmund Hargrove. Catherine Hargrove, born Catherine Peton, had married Edmund in 1837. She came from Charleston, from wealth that rivaled the Hargroves. The marriage had been arranged, as most were, a union designed to strengthen both families. She was beautiful in the way Southern society demanded, her pale skin protected from the sun, her dark hair perfectly arranged, her waist corseted to fashionable narrowness. She had been educated at Charleston's finest academy, trained in French, piano, watercolors, and the subtle art of managing a household while appearing to do nothing. Their wedding had been the social event of the season, 400 guests at St. Michael's Church. Everyone said they made a perfect couple. Everyone said their children would be beautiful. But 6 years into the marriage, there were no children. This was whispered in parlors, always with that mixture of pity and judgment society reserved for women who failed their primary duty. The weight of those whispers was felt by Catherine. She saw the thinly veiled disappointment of Edmund's mother. She knew her value diminished with each passing year. What Catherine did not fully understand was why there were no children. Why Edmund came to her bed so rarely, why he seemed distant, his mind elsewhere even when his body was present. The truth lived in the quarters behind the main house. The truth had names, Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel. Marcus was 24, the son of the plantation's head cook, light-skinned with features that hinted at a mixed ancestry no one spoke of openly. He had worked in the main. Catherine waited until the house was dark and still. She heard Edmund's footsteps in the hallway, heard him descend the servants' stairs. She gave him 10 minutes, enough time to reach the east wing, to settle in, to believe himself safe. Then she rose from her bed, wrapped a dark shawl around her white nightgown, and followed. The garden was illuminated only by a quarter moon and a faint glow from slave quarters. Carefully, Catherine moved, her bare feet silent on brick paths. She could hear cicadas in the trees, distant river sounds, her own heart pounding so hard she thought it might wake the entire plantation. She reached the east wing. The side door was slightly ajar. Light flickered from within, casting shifting shadows. Slowly, Catherine approached, her breath shallow, her hands trembling. She looked through the gap in the door. The room was larger than expected, furnished with a care that made clear this was no temporary arrangement. The space was dominated by the bed, covered in fine linens Catherine recognized as missing from the household inventory. Across the scene, oil lamps cast warm light. On the bed was Edmund, unclothed, his body intertwined with 3 others. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were with him, moving together in ways that left no doubt about what was happening. The sounds, the intimacy, the obvious familiarity of their movements spoke of an ongoing, practiced, comfortable relationship. To her mouth, Catherine's hand flew, stifling the scream rising in her throat. She stood frozen, unable to look away, unable to process what she was seeing. Her husband, the respectable planter, church deacon, pillar of society, was engaging in acts that were not only illegal, but considered the deepest possible depravity. In 1843 South Carolina, what Catherine witnessed was a crime punishable by death, not just for Edmund, but for Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel as well. No distinction was made by the law, no mercy was shown. The act itself was called sodomy, though that word was rarely spoken aloud. It was considered an abomination, a sin so terrible that even discussing it could corrupt decent people. Perhaps 30 seconds, Catherine watched, though it felt like an eternity. She watched Edmund kiss Marcus with a tenderness she had never experienced in their marriage. She watched Samuel's hands move across Edmund's back with obvious familiarity. She watched Daniel whisper something that made Edmund laugh. A genuine, unguarded laugh she had not heard in years. In that moment, watching her husband show more authentic emotion and desire with 3 enslaved men than he had ever shown with her, something cold and hard crystallized in Catherine's chest. Not just betrayal, though that was present. Not just humiliation, though she felt that, too. What she felt was rage, pure, focused, calculating rage. 6 years of her life she had given this man, endured whispers and judgment, diminished herself, trying to be the perfect wife. And all the while he had been here in this room with these men, living his true life while she lived a lie. From the door, Catherine backed away, her mind already racing. She returned to the house, climbed the stairs to her room, and sat at her writing desk. Her hands were steady now, her breathing calm. She lit a candle and pulled out paper. She began to write 3 letters, one to Edmund's mother, one to Sheriff Charles Dunor, one to Edmund himself. In each, she described what she had witnessed, sparing no necessary detail to convey the full horror. She sealed all 3 letters, then walked to Edmund's door and slid his letter underneath. She returned to her room and lay in bed, fully dressed, waiting for sunrise. At dawn, the letter was found by Edmund. He picked it up, broke the seal, read it. From his face, color drained. His hands began shaking. He read it 3 times as if repetition might change the words. Catherine had seen him. She knew everything. And she had already written to the sheriff and his mother. Panic was Edmund's first instinct. Run, saddle a horse, ride north, disappear. But where would he go? He was a plantation owner whose entire identity was tied to this land. He had no skills beyond managing enslaved labor and maintaining social position. Without Willowbrook, without the Hargrove name, he was nothing. Denial was his second instinct. Perhaps he could convince Catherine she had misunderstood. But even as these thoughts formed, he knew they were desperate and foolish. Details proving beyond doubt she had witnessed exactly what she claimed had been described by Catherine. His third instinct was rage. How dare she threaten him? But that rage died quickly. Because Edmund knew the truth. He had betrayed her, lived a lie, and in the rigid moral universe of the antebellum South, what he had done was unforgivable. He walked to Catherine's bedroom and knocked. No answer. He tried the handle. Locked. He knocked again, harder. "Catherine, we must talk, please." Her voice came from behind the door, calm and cold. "There is nothing to discuss, Edmund. The letters have been sent. Sheriff Dunmore will arrive within the hour. Your mother shortly after. I suggest you use whatever time remains to make peace with God, since you will have no peace in this world." Against the door, Edmund pressed his forehead. "Please, Catherine, I can explain. Explain how you have spent 3 years defiling yourself and your slaves. Explain how you have made a mockery of our marriage and our name. There is no explanation that matters, Edmund. You are a sodomite. That is what you are. That is all you are, and everyone will know it by sunset." At 7:30, Sheriff Dunmore arrived with 2 deputies. At the door, Catherine met them, still in her nightclothes. She invited them inside, offered coffee, explained the situation with the calm, measured tone of a woman reporting a property dispute. The sheriff was a large man, 60 years old, with a gray beard and eyes that had seen every variety of human wickedness. He had known Edmund since the man was a boy, attended the wedding, been a guest at Christmas parties. As he listened to Catherine describe what she witnessed, as he read her detailed account, his face darkened with a betrayal mixed with disgust, mixed with the cold determination of a man who knew exactly what the law required. "These are serious charges, Mrs. Hargrove. The most serious a man can face in this state. I am aware, Sheriff, which is why I sent for you immediately. My husband is in his study. The 3 slaves he was with are in the quarters. I want them all arrested. I want this handled according to the full extent of the law." Slowly, the sheriff nodded. "Where did this incident occur?" "The East Wing. There is a room there furnished for this purpose. You will find everything exactly as I described." To his deputies, Sheriff Dunmore motioned. They moved through the house with Catherine leading. She showed them the East Wing, the side door, the room itself. The bed was still unmade, the lamp still burning low. Everywhere was evidence of what occurred, impossible to deny. The sheriff's jaw tightened. This was a violation not just of law, but of the entire social order. Edmund Hargrove was one of the wealthiest men in the county, a respected citizen, a community leader. And now he would have to be destroyed publicly and completely because the alternative was to let such behavior stand unpunished, which would shake the very foundations of their society. "Arrest Mr. Hargrove," the sheriff told his deputies. "Bring him to the town jail, then go to the quarters and arrest the 3 slaves, Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel." To the study, the deputies moved. Edmund did not resist. He stood when they entered, set down his glass, held out his wrists for shackles. His face was blank, empty of expression. He looked at Catherine once as they led him past her in the hallway. Without flinching, she met his gaze. "I hope you understand what you have done," Edmund said quietly. "This will destroy you as much as it destroys me." Catherine smiled, a cold, terrible smile. "I know exactly what I have done. I have revealed you for what you are. I will survive this, Edmund. I will return to Charleston, to my family. I will be the wronged wife, the innocent victim of your depravity. But you will be nothing. Just a name people whisper about, a cautionary tale, a warning about the consequences of unnatural vice." Nothing more was said by Edmund. Outside, deputies led him to a waiting wagon. Within minutes, he was on his way to Beaufort Town Jail, shackled like a common criminal. So sudden and complete was his fall from grace it seemed almost unreal. From the quarters in chains, Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were taken. In silent horror, their families watched, understanding their loved ones were caught in something that would likely end in death. In 1843 South Carolina, slaves had no legal defense against such charges. If a white man claimed they participated in sodomy, their guilt was assumed. By noon, all 4 men were locked in separate cells. By evening, everyone in Beaufort knew. Like wildfire, the news spread, whispered in shops and parlors, discussed in horrified tones over dinners, debated in taverns. Edmund Hargrove, the respectable planter, was a sodomite caught in the act with 3 male slaves. His wife had discovered him and reported him to the law. So enormous was the scandal it dwarfed every other topic. Nothing else mattered except this one terrible revelation. The week between Edmund's arrest and his trial felt suspended in time, as if all of Buffett was holding its breath. Of this magnitude, the town had never experienced a scandal. They had seen murder. They had seen theft, adultery, drunkenness, violence, all the usual sins had passed through the courthouse. But this was different. This touched something deeper and more terrifying. A violation so profound it threatened the very order of their world. Over Beaufort County's legal proceedings, Judge Howard Middleton presided. 68 years old, a War of 1812 veteran, he was known for strict law interpretation and an unwavering commitment to maintaining social order. When he received the documents related to Edmund's arrest, he sat in his chambers for over an hour, reading and rereading the charges. He had known Edmund since childhood, signed the marriage license, approved loans for Willowbrook expansion. Now he was being asked to preside over Edmund's destruction. The law was clear. South Carolina statutes defined sodomy as the abominable crime against nature, prescribing a punishment of either death or such lesser penalty as the court deemed appropriate, though the statute strongly implied death was preferred. No ambiguity, no room for interpretation. The act itself, if proven, demanded the harshest consequences, but Judge Middleton faced complications. Edmund was white, wealthy, from a founding family. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were enslaved, property, legally worth perhaps $800 each. The law theoretically applied equally, but in practice, everyone knew enslaved people would be punished more severely and quickly. The question was how to handle Edmund without creating a precedent that might threaten other wealthy white men with secrets they preferred hidden. On August 15, a private meeting was called by Judge Middleton. Present were Sheriff Dunmore, County Prosecutor Richard Fellows, 3 prominent citizens, including the mayor, and 2 church deacons. Catherine was not invited, nor was anyone representing Edmund. "Gentlemen," the judge began, "we face a situation requiring both justice and discretion. The charges against Mr. Hargrove are supported by unimpeachable evidence. His wife witnessed the crime directly. Physical evidence corroborates her testimony. If this were any other man, any man of lesser standing, we would proceed directly to conviction and sentencing without hesitation. But it is not any other man. It is Edmund Hargrove," interjected Mayor Thomas Pritchard. "His family has been part of this community for 3 generations. His plantation employs hundreds directly or indirectly. If we execute him, what happens to his slaves? His property, the debts he owes and debts owed to him?" Prosecutor Fellows, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, shook his head firmly. "With respect, Mayor, we cannot allow wealth or status considerations to interfere with justice. If we treat Mr. Hargrove differently than we would treat a poor farmer or shopkeeper, we undermine the entire foundation of law. The crime is the same regardless of who commits it." "Fellows is right," added Sheriff Dunmore. "I have the man in my jail. The 3 slaves who participated. If we let any escape justice, what message does that send? That the wealthy can do whatever they wish? That the law only applies to common folk?" Reverend Samuel Cartwright spoke, his voice grave with moral certainty. "This is not merely a legal matter, gentlemen. It is a spiritual crisis. What Mr. Hargrove has done is an abomination before God. It corrupts the natural order, threatens the moral foundation of our society. If we show mercy, soften the punishment, we suggest such behavior is somehow forgivable. We cannot do that. We must not." Slowly, Judge Middleton nodded. Then let me propose a course of action. We will hold a trial. Given the circumstances, conviction is certain, but I will use my discretion in sentencing. Mr. Hargrove will not be executed. The room erupted in objections. Several men speaking at once. The judge raised a hand for silence. Hear me out. Death would be a mercy for a man in his position. A quick end, a closed coffin, a private burial. His family could mourn and move on. No. What I propose is worse than death. A public punishment of such severity that Edmund Hargrove will wish we had hanged him. Destroy not just his body but his soul, his reputation, his very identity. Make the entire community witness it so everyone understands exactly what happens to men who commit this crime. What form would this punishment take? The prosecutor asked. Cold and calculating was Judge Middleton's expression. The pillory and whipping post in the town square, but not for an hour or two. For 3 full days. Locked in the pillory from dawn to dusk, exposed to the elements, insects, jeers, and curses of anyone who passes. And at noon each day, a public whipping, not enough to kill him, but enough to scar him permanently. Enough to ensure for the rest of his life he carries the marks of shame on his body. The room fell silent. Even the men most insistent on harsh punishment seemed taken aback by the brutality of the proposal. And the slaves? Reverend Cartwright asked quietly. They will be hanged, the judge said without hesitation. They are property who corrupted their master. They seduced him into depravity. They will serve as an example of what happens when slaves step beyond their place. The executions will precede Mr. Hargrove's punishment by 1 day. So he would know what his actions had cost them. Sheriff Dunor frowned. That is not just, Your Honor. By all accounts, Hargrove initiated these relationships. The slaves had no choice. They could not refuse their master. Justice and necessity are not always aligned, Sheriff. The law requires all participants in sodomy be punished. More importantly, white citizens need to see the natural order restored. White men may fall, but they fall from a great height. Slaves who participate in such acts must be eliminated entirely. It is harsh but the only way to maintain control. Glances were exchanged by the men. Slowly, reluctantly they nodded their agreement. The solution satisfied no one completely but balanced the competing demands of law, social hierarchy, and the need to make an example that would resonate far beyond Beaufort. But Judge Middleton had not factored in Catherine Hargrove. She was not present, but she had sources. One of the judge's clerks, young Benjamin Porter, who was courting Catherine's cousin, overheard the conversation and repeated it to his fiancée, who immediately sent word to Catherine. When Catherine learned the plan, she was not satisfied. She had wanted Edmund destroyed, but she had not considered that Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel would be executed. Despite everything, despite her rage, she understood these 3 men had been trapped in an impossible situation. They were property. They had no choice but to obey their master's commands. To execute them for Edmund's depravity seemed like a miscarriage of justice, even by the twisted standards of a slave society. But Catherine also understood something else. If Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel died before Edmund's public punishment, if they were hanged and buried before the town witnessed Edmund's humiliation, then Edmund would become a martyr of sorts. People would whisper he had loved his slaves, sacrificed himself for them, that there was something tragic and romantic about his fall. That narrative, Catherine could not allow. She sent word to Judge Middleton, requesting a private meeting. He agreed, curious about what the woman at the scandal center could possibly want. They met in his chambers 2 days before the trial. Catherine arrived, dressed in full mourning black, though no one had died. A deliberate choice, a visual representation of the death of her marriage, her hopes, her future. She sat across from the judge with perfect posture, her hands folded, her expression calm. Your Honor, I have heard of your intended sentence for my husband and the 3 slaves involved in this crime. The judge raised an eyebrow. That was a private discussion, Mrs. Hargrove. In a town this size, Your Honor, very little remains private for long. But I am not here to question your authority or judgment. I am here to make a request. Speak then. I request that the punishment of all 4 men occur simultaneously, that Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel not be hanged separately, but be present during Edmund's 3 days in the pillory and whipping. That they be forced to watch what becomes of the man who used them, and that Edmund be forced to watch their executions on the final day after his punishment is complete. The judge leaned back, studying her. That is remarkably cruel, Mrs. Hargrove, even for a wronged wife. My husband showed me no mercy, Your Honor. He showed our marriage no respect. He showed God's law no reverence. Why should I show him mercy now? Why should he be granted the dignity of being punished alone where he can imagine himself the victim? Let him see what his desires have caused. Let him watch those 3 men die knowing his actions brought them to the gallows. Let the entire town see the complete picture of his depravity and its consequences. For a long moment, Judge Middleton was silent, then he nodded slowly. Your request is granted. I will modify the sentence accordingly. The trial will proceed in 3 days. Punishment will begin the day after the verdict. It will be exactly as you described. Catherine stood, smoothed her black skirts, offered the judge a small, cold smile. Thank you, Your Honor. Justice should be complete. The entire story should be told. Nothing should be hidden. On August 18, 1843, the trial began. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. People stood in the aisles, crowded the doorways, pressed against the windows, trying to hear every word. This was not just a trial. It was the social event of the decade. A spectacle that would be discussed and debated for years. In shackles, Edmund was brought. He had not been allowed to change clothes since his arrest. His once fine shirt was stained and wrinkled, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. He looked like a man who had already died inside, going through the motions of living because he had no other choice. Separately, Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were brought, also in chains, made to stand in the courtroom corner, guarded by armed deputies. Their faces showed different emotions. Marcus looked resigned, almost peaceful, as if he had accepted what was coming. Samuel's jaw was set, his eyes burning with quiet rage. Daniel was trembling, tears running silently down his face. His seat was taken by Judge Middleton. The prosecutor rose and presented the charges. Then Catherine was called to testify. To the witness stand, she walked with her head held high. She wore dark gray now, still mourning colors, but slightly less severe. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, then in a clear steady voice described in exact detail what she had witnessed on the morning of August 12. Utterly silent was the courtroom as she spoke. Men shifted uncomfortably. Women fanned themselves, whether from the heat or shock, it was impossible to say. Every word Catherine uttered was like a hammer blow, destroying Edmund's reputation, his dignity, his very humanity. When she finished, the prosecutor asked, Mrs. Hargrove, is there any possibility you misunderstood what you saw? No, sir. There is no possibility of misunderstanding. What I witnessed was clear, unmistakable, and deliberate. My husband was engaged in an act of sodomy with 3 male slaves. He was not coerced, not confused. He was participating willingly and enthusiastically in acts that violate every law of God and man. The defense attorney, young William Crawford, assigned to Edmund's case, and clearly wishing he had not been, stood for cross-examination. Mrs. Hargrove, is it possible your husband's behavior was the result of temporary insanity, that he was not in his right mind? Catherine's eyes narrowed. My husband has been engaging in this behavior for at least 3 years, Mr. Crawford. That is not temporary insanity. That is a deliberate choice. That is who he is. A few more questions were tried by Crawford, but each only made Edmund's situation worse. Finally, he sat down, defeated. There was no defense to be made. The evidence was overwhelming, the witness unshakable. Edmund was asked if he wished to testify. He shook his head. What could he possibly say? The truth was undeniable. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were not allowed to testify. Slaves could not give evidence in court except in limited circumstances. And this was not one. Their guilt was assumed based on Catherine's testimony and the physical evidence. They had no voice, no chance to explain or defend. They simply stood in a corner, waiting for the inevitable verdict. The jury was addressed by Judge Middleton, though everyone knew their decision was predetermined. Gentlemen of the jury, you have heard the testimony, seen the evidence. The law is clear on this matter. Sodomy is a crime of the highest order, an abomination that threatens the moral fabric of our society. You must now determine whether the accused are guilty of this crime. Less than 10 minutes, the jury deliberated. When they returned, the foreman stood and delivered the verdict. We find the defendant Edmund Hargrove guilty of sodomy. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Some voices expressed satisfaction. Others sounded shocked even though the outcome had been certain. We find the slaves Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel guilty of sodomy and of corrupting their master. This verdict was delivered more quietly, almost as an afterthought. The three men's fate had never been in question. They were already dead in the eyes of the law. The jury simply made it official. Judge Middleton nodded. The court accepts the verdict. We will proceed to sentencing. He paused, letting the tension build. Every person leaned forward, waiting to hear what punishment would be decreed. Edmund Hargrove, you have been found guilty of the abominable crime of sodomy. The law permits me to sentence you to death, and many believe that would be the appropriate punishment. However, I believe death would be too merciful. You have violated not just the law but the sacred trust of your position, corrupted your slaves, abused your authority, brought shame upon your family and community. Edmund closed his eyes, waiting for the sentence to continue. Therefore, I sentence you to 3 days of public punishment. You will be locked in the pillory in the town square from dawn to dusk each day. At noon each day, you will receive 20 lashes with a whip. You will be marked permanently so for the rest of your life. You carry evidence of your crime upon your body, and you will witness the execution of the 3 slaves whose lives you destroyed with your unnatural desires. A gasp went through the courtroom. 3 days in the pillory was brutal enough, but 60 lashes total would leave a man scarred and broken. Forcing Edmund to watch the executions was a psychological torture many found excessive even given the severity of the crime. As for Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel, the judge continued, turning to face the 3 enslaved men. You are sentenced to death by hanging. The execution will take place in the town square on the afternoon of the 3rd day of Edmund Hargrove's punishment, so he may witness the consequences of the corruption he brought upon you. Daniel collapsed. Deputies caught him before he hit the floor, held him upright. Samuel's face remained impassive, but his hands clenched into fists. Marcus looked directly at Edmund for the first time since the trial began, and the expression on his face was not anger or fear. It was something worse. It was pity. Judge Middleton struck the gavel. This court is adjourned. The sentence will be carried out beginning tomorrow at dawn. May God have mercy on all your souls. The courtroom erupted in conversation as people filed out. Some satisfied justice had been served, others disturbed by the severity. Many were already planning to attend the public spectacle, drawn by morbid curiosity and the knowledge they were about to witness something that had never happened in Beaufort before. Without looking at Edmund, Catherine left. She had achieved what she set out to do. The truth was public. Edmund was destroyed. She would soon be free to leave this place and never return. Too quickly, morning came. The sun rose over Beaufort, casting golden light across the town square. People were already gathering, chairs set up for prominent citizens. Others stood in groups talking in low voices. Children were kept home, but teenagers and adults filled the square until there was barely room to move. In the center stood the pillory, a wooden frame with holes for the head and hands, and beside it the whipping post, a thick wooden pole with iron rings for securing the condemned. Both had been freshly painted, as if someone wanted them to look their best for this historic occasion. At dawn, Edmund was brought from the jail. He wore only trousers, his torso bare, his feet without shoes, his hands bound behind his back. To the pillory, deputies led him and locked him in position, his head and hands secured, his body bent forward, completely immobilized. The morning sun was already hot. Within an hour, Edmund was sweating. Within 2 hours, flies had found him. Within 3 hours, his back was burning from sun exposure and his legs were shaking from the strain of standing in one position. And the people watched, some jeered and called insults. Others simply stared in silence. A few felt pity but kept it to themselves, knowing that expressing sympathy for a sodomite would bring suspicion on their own character. Mid-morning, Catherine arrived, accompanied by 2 female relatives from Charleston, who had come to support her. She stood a distance from the pillory, not close enough to speak to Edmund, but close enough that he could see her if he raised his eyes. She wanted him to know she was there. Witnessing his humiliation, ensuring it was complete. From the jail, Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel had been brought and forced to stand at the square's edge, chained together, guarded by deputies. They watched Edmund's punishment with varying reactions. Marcus kept his expression neutral, showing nothing. Samuel watched with grim satisfaction, glad to see the man who used him now suffering. Daniel could not watch at all. He kept his eyes on the ground, unable to bear the sight. At noon, the real punishment began. With a long leather whip, Sheriff Dunmore approached the pillory. Edmund Hargrove, the sheriff announced loud enough for everyone to hear. You have been sentenced to 20 lashes. May this punishment serve as a reminder of the consequences of your crime and as a warning to any other man who might be tempted to follow your path. Edmund's body tensed. He had been whipped once as a child, a few strokes for childhood mischief, but that had been nothing compared to what was coming. He tried to prepare himself, but there was no preparing for this. Without further warning, the first lash came. Across Edmund's bare back, the leather strip cut with a crack that echoed across the square. Edmund gasped but did not cry out. On his skin, a thin line of red appeared. Quickly, the second lash followed. Then the third. By the 5th lash, Edmund was groaning with each blow. By the 10th, he was crying out, unable to maintain composure. By the 15th, he was sobbing, his body shaking with each impact. The skin on his back was torn in multiple places, blood running down to soak into the waistband of his trousers. Finally, the 20th lash came. In the pillory, Edmund sagged, held upright only by the wooden frame imprisoning him. Silent now was the crowd. The initial excitement of witnessing punishment was replaced by the uncomfortable reality of watching a human being broken. The whip was coiled by Sheriff Dunmore and he stepped back. Until sunset, Edmund would remain in the pillory. Still exposed, still suffering. But at least the whipping was over for today. He drifted in and out of consciousness as the afternoon stretched endlessly. People came and went, some staying for hours, others just passing through to see the spectacle with their own eyes. Finally, as the sun approached the horizon, the sheriff returned. He unlocked the pillory and Edmund collapsed immediately, unable to stand. He was caught by deputies, dragged back to the jail where a doctor had been ordered to examine him and ensure he would survive to endure the next 2 days. Exactly like the first, the second day began. At dawn, Edmund was brought out, locked in the pillory, exposed to the sun and insects and jeers of the crowd. His back was a mass of scabbed lacerations from the previous day's whipping. Every movement pulled at the wounds, sending fresh waves of pain through his body. As she had the day before, Catherine returned. She stood in her black dress, her face shaded by a parasol, watching without expression. People had begun whispering about her, calling her cruel, calling her vindictive. But they also understood her rage. She had been wronged in a way few women could imagine. At noon, the whipping began again. 20 more lashes across Edmund's already damaged back. This time he screamed from the first blow. There was no dignity left, no strength to maintain composure. He screamed and begged and pleaded for mercy, but none came. The law had decreed 20 lashes and 20 lashes he received. When it was over, Edmund's back looked like raw meat. The doctor would later comment he had never seen a man whipped so severely survive, but Edmund did survive, though there were moments when he wished he had not. The third day arrived. For the final time, Edmund was brought to the pillory. His body was barely recognizable. His back was covered in blood-soaked bandages. His face was swollen from sun exposure and insect bites. His legs could barely support his weight, but the sentence was clear. 3 days in the pillory, 3 sessions of whipping. The law would be fulfilled. That day, the crowd was the largest yet. Throughout the county, word had spread. People had traveled from neighboring towns to witness the conclusion of Edmund Hargrove's punishment and the execution of the 3 slaves. So packed was the square that deputies had to form a perimeter to keep the crowd from pressing too close to the pillory and the gallows that had been erected overnight. The gallows were simple but effective, a wooden platform with 3 nooses hanging from a crossbeam. They had been positioned so Edmund, locked in the pillory, would have a clear view of the executions. This was Catherine's final gift to her husband, the knowledge that his desires had directly caused these men's deaths and the obligation to watch as they died. At noon, came the final 20 lashes. This time, Edmund barely reacted. He was beyond screaming, beyond begging. He simply endured, his body jerking with each impact, blood flowing freely from reopened wounds. When the whipping ended, he hung limply in the pillory, more dead than alive. But he was conscious. That was important. The doctor had been instructed to keep him conscious no matter what because he needed to witness what came next. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were brought from the jail. Through the crowd, they walked, their chains clanking with each step. People fell silent as the 3 men climbed the steps to the gallows platform. On the platform waiting, stood Minister Reverend Cartwright. He held a Bible and attempted to offer final prayers, but he was interrupted by Daniel. "Save your prayers, Reverend," Daniel said, his voice surprisingly strong despite his fear. "We do not need prayers from a God who allowed this to happen. If there is a God who sees what is happening here today and does nothing to stop it, then that God is no God at all." As if struck, Reverend recoiled. "You blaspheme in your final moments." "In my final moments, I speak truth," Daniel replied. "Something no one else in this town seems capable of doing." Next, Samuel spoke, looking out at the crowd. "You call us criminals. You call us corruptors. But we never had a choice. When our master called us, we came. That is what slaves do. We survive however we can. And now you kill us to protect your own sense of order. Remember that. Remember what you did here today." Nothing was said by Marcus. He simply looked at Edmund, still locked in the pillory 20 feet away. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and something passed between them, some final acknowledgement of the strange and terrible relationship they had shared. The executioner, a man named John Kelly, who served as the county's designated hangman, placed nooses around each man's neck. He adjusted them carefully, ensuring they would work as intended, then stepped back and waited for the signal from Judge Middleton, who stood at the base of the gallows. At his pocket watch, the judge looked. At exactly 2:15, he nodded. The executioner pulled the lever. Simultaneously, the trap doors beneath Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel opened. The 3 men dropped, the ropes went taut, and their necks broke with audible cracks that carried across the silent square. At least they died quickly. That was the only mercy afforded them. Gently, the bodies swung in the afternoon breeze. 3 men who had been property in life, remained property, even in death. It all was watched by Edmund. He watched Marcus die. He watched Samuel die. He watched Daniel die. And something inside him broke that no amount of physical punishment could have broken. He made a sound, a low wailing cry that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside his shattered soul. A sound of anguish and despair and guilt that would haunt everyone who heard it for the rest of their lives. For an hour, the bodies were left hanging, as was customary, to ensure death was complete and serve as a final warning. Then they were cut down and loaded into a wagon. They would be buried in unmarked graves on the edge of town in a section reserved for criminals and slaves who died without family to claim them. At sunset, Edmund was finally released from the pillory. He collapsed immediately. He had to be carried back to the jail. The doctor examined him and declared he would survive, though recovery would be long and painful. That evening, Judge Middleton came to Edmund's cell. He looked down at the broken man lying unconscious, barely conscious, covered in bandages, his spirit as damaged as his body. "Mr. Hargrove, you have served your sentence. You are free to go. But understand this, you are no longer welcome in Beaufort. No longer welcome anywhere in South Carolina. If you remain here, if you attempt to reclaim your property or position, you will find society has closed its doors permanently. My advice is to leave, go west, go north, go anywhere but here, and pray no one where you land ever learns your name or history." Nothing was said by Edmund. There was nothing to say. His life as he had known it was over. Everything he had been, everything he had worked for was gone. He was a ghost now, a living reminder of what happened to men who violated the unwritten rules of Southern society. 3 days later, after enough recovery that he could stand and walk with assistance, Edmund left Beaufort. He took nothing but the clothes on his back and a small amount of money the court had allowed him to keep from the sale of his possessions. At auction, Willowbrook Plantation was sold to pay debts. The enslaved people, including Marcus's wife Rachel, were sold separately to various buyers throughout the region. The house was purchased by a family from Charleston who renamed it and tried to erase all connection to the Hargrove name. Into the vastness of America, Edmund disappeared. Some said he went to Texas. Others claimed he died within a year, unable to survive without the privilege and protection he had always known. A few whispered he went to California during the gold rush, lost himself among thousands of other men running from their pasts. But for certain, no one knew. Edmund Hargrove simply ceased to exist as thoroughly as if he had been executed alongside Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel. As she had planned, Catherine returned to Charleston. She resumed her maiden name, Peon, and told everyone her husband had died. In a sense, this was true. The man she had married no longer existed. Her family welcomed her back, sympathetic to her ordeal, understanding she had been an innocent victim of a monstrous deception. She never remarried. She lived quietly, managing her inheritance, attending church, maintaining the appearance of a respectable widow. But people who knew her said something had changed in her eyes, something hard and cold that had not been there before. She had destroyed her husband completely and in doing so had perhaps destroyed something in herself as well. Years passed. The scandal of Willowbrook Plantation faded from immediate memory, though it remained a cautionary tale whispered to young men about the consequences of unnatural vice. As Judge Middleton had ordered, the county documents remained sealed, protecting the reputations of the families involved. But in 1897, 54 years after the events occurred, something unexpected happened. A young historian named Thomas Bradford, researching antebellum South Carolina for his doctoral thesis, applied for access to the sealed county records. After considerable debate, a judge granted permission, reasoning that enough time had passed, that everyone directly involved was long dead, that history deserved the truth. For 3 months, Bradford spent reading through the documents, trial transcripts, Catherine's testimony, letters between the judge and various officials, eyewitness accounts of the punishment and executions, medical reports on Edmund's condition, financial records of the plantation sale. Everything had been meticulously preserved. Shocked was Bradford by what he discovered. not just by the events themselves, though those were disturbing enough, but by what the documents revealed about antebellum society, the rigid moral codes enforced through spectacular public violence, laws that made no distinction between willing participants and enslaved people who had no choice, a community's eagerness to witness suffering, to participate in the destruction of one of their own when he violated the social order. In 1899, he published his findings in an academic journal with limited circulation. The article caused minor controversy among historians but was largely ignored by the general public. The story was too old, too disturbing, too at odds with the romantic myths about the Old South that were being promoted in that era. Then in 1923, 80 years after the scandal, Beaufort County finally opened all sealed documents to the public. A brief article about the Hargrove case was run by the local newspaper, presenting it as an interesting historical curiosity. The article mentioned that Catherine Petton had lived until 192, dying at age 87 in Charleston. That Edmund Hargrove's ultimate fate remained unknown. That descendants of Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel's families still lived in the region, though most had never known the full story of how their ancestors died. The article concluded with an observation that seemed to miss the entire point: it was a different time with different standards of morality and justice. We can only be grateful that we live in a more enlightened era. But was it really so different? That was the question that haunted the few people who truly understood the story. The laws had changed. Yes. Public executions were no longer permitted. Torture was no longer a legal punishment. But the human capacity for cruelty in service of maintaining social order, for using the law to destroy those who threatened established hierarchies, for creating scapegoats and demanding blood sacrifices to appease collective fear and rage. Had any of that truly changed? In 2015, a small historical society in Beaufort erected a marker near the site where the gallows had stood in 1843. The marker acknowledged that 3 enslaved men, Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel, last names unknown, had been executed on this spot for crimes that modern understanding recognized they could not have refused to commit. The marker called it an injustice, called it a tragedy, called it a reminder of laws and social systems that valued property rights over human dignity. Nothing about Edmund Hargrove was said by the marker, nothing about Catherine, nothing about the 3 days in the pillory or the 60 lashes that left permanent scars. That part of the story remained too uncomfortable, too complex, too resistant to simple moral lessons about past injustices. Because Edmund was both perpetrator and victim, he had used his power to coerce enslaved men into sexual relationships, making him an abuser regardless of his own desires. But he had also been destroyed by a society that gave him no way to exist as who he truly was, forcing him to hide, to lie, to create a secret room where he could be authentic for a few stolen hours. Catherine was both victim and perpetrator. She had been genuinely wronged, trapped in a loveless marriage, subjected to years of humiliation and judgment. But she had also orchestrated a punishment of extraordinary cruelty, ensuring not just Edmund's physical destruction, but his psychological and spiritual annihilation. The purest victims in the story were Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel. Men who had no choices, no power, no voice, who were used and then executed to maintain a social order they had no role in creating. Their deaths were legal murder, sanctioned by the courts and witnessed by hundreds who convinced themselves they were upholding justice and morality. And the crowd of 347 citizens who gathered in Beaufort Town Square over those 3 August days in 1843. Who watched a man being tortured and 3 men being hanged. Who brought their families to witness. Who jeered and threw things and called it righteousness. What were they? Were they monsters? Or were they ordinary people who had been taught that maintaining social order required spectacular violence, that some lives were worth less than others, that public suffering served a higher purpose? These questions have no easy answers. History rarely does. What happened at Willowbrook Plantation and in Beaufort Town Square was not an aberration. It was the logical extension of laws and social systems that existed throughout the antebellum South, throughout America, throughout human societies that build themselves on hierarchies of power and enforce those hierarchies through violence. The story remains disturbing not because it is so different from our world, but because it reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature, about how quickly compassion disappears when we are told that cruelty serves justice, about how easily we convince ourselves that destroying others protects our own safety and virtue. All dead now are Edmund Hargrove, Catherine Petton, Marcus, Samuel, Daniel, Judge Middleton, Sheriff Dunn, Reverend Cartwright, and the 347 witnesses. Their world is gone. But echoes of what they did, the choices they made, the violence they perpetrated or witnessed or endured, those echoes remain. Listen carefully and you can still hear them. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there still secrets buried in Beaufort's past? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this dark tale from American history and want more stories like this, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. Hit that notification bell and share with someone who loves historical mysteries. See you in the next video, where we will uncover another forgotten nightmare from America's past.